A man once told me if you want a good story just ask any random person if there was ever an event in their life they cannot explain. Someone almost always has one weird thing that has happened to them. So Reddit, regardless of whatever you believe about the world, do you have a story as such? This one isn't quite supernatural, but it was weird. I live in a very homogeneous area. I know everyone on my street and almost everyone in my neighborhood. Everybody is white middle class. I had recently got a cat, who I loved, but was an idiot of an animal. One day she ran up tree with absolutely no branches and just sat at the top. Would not come down. I live next to a contractor who had helped get her down from another tree, but said he couldn't do anything this time. The tree was too thin and, like I said, no branches until the very top. If I had to estimate, I'd say the cat was 20-25 feet high. I was pretty upset. I sat there waiting for her until about 2 AM and then I just had to go home and I passed out on the couch. At 4 AM I hear really loud knocking on my door. I open it to see a man fully decked out in camo gear, including light face paint. He was holding my cat. Here's the conversation we had, almost verbatim. In a thick Russian accent he asks, "Is this yours? How the heck did you get her down?" I climb. That tree had no branches. In my training I learned climb. EET no problem. Let me pay you. Where do you even live? He shook his head and just walked away basically while I was in mid-sentence. He looked almost concerned, but he might have just been amused. I never saw him again. I never even saw another person with a Russian accent near my neighborhood. And now my cat stays indoors. TLDR. Very well hidden Russian special ops are planning to invade, but before they do, one saved my cat from a tree. Back when my mother was about 18, she's 43 today, she was visited by what she calls the tapper. Every night for 3 months, someone would tap on the window of the room she was in as soon as she was alone, even with the curtains drawn. Every single night, without fail. As soon as anyone else came into the room or went outside to investigate, it would stop, and no one would be outside. My grandpa and both uncles were living in the house too. This is relevant. After 3 months of this, the tapping stopped. My grandpa and both uncles decided to take off fishing one night. The tapping hadn't happened in 2 weeks at this point, and my mom stayed behind. The sun had just gone down and my mom was sitting in the living room reading, and it happens. Tap 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 tap. She assumes it's my younger uncle because he is a joker. Jesse, knock it off. Tap 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 tap. Jesse, it's not funny. Just get inside. Tap tap tap. She gets up from the couch and goes to the window, which still has the curtains drawn. Very freaking funny, Jesse. She taps on the window, through the curtain. Tap 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 tap. Instead of tapping, it sounds like a hand slams against the window in response. She goes back to the couch, still convinced it's my uncle, and almost immediately the phone rings. My grandpa is calling her from the neighbor's house to tell her they stopped in to say hey, and the neighbors offered to help them dress the fish. Well, take Jesse back there with you and make him stop slamming on the windows. Rhonda, Jesse is here. Oh crap. She runs to the front door and locks it, leaving the phone off of the hook. My grandpa says they're coming over and hangs up. It takes them about a minute to run up the road from the neighbors. When they get there, they see a guy standing by the front window in the bushes. He stands up when they start screaming and takes off towards the fence. This guy looks like he's a good 7 feet tall from what my grandpa told me. They chase him to the property line where a wooden fence separates from the next neighbor's property, and he jumps over the fence, which is 7 feet high. No hands, legs completely over the top. They clamber over the fence to keep chasing him, and he can't be more than 1-2 seconds ahead of the 3 of them, and he's gone. Straight up gone. The property on that side of the fence was just dirt and grass, no trees or buildings. The neighbor's house was a long distance from the fence, and nothing else was around to hide in. They never heard the tapping or saw anyone that looked like this guy again. This one creeped me the frick out. A few years ago, I was working on a construction site which was overseen by a safety representative who, as they should, took his job very seriously. One time I had to get into a very tight ceiling cavity, so I set my hard hat down beside my ladder and crawled into the roof space. I had to tidy up some cable looms, which took about 10 minutes, and I came back down the ladder to find my hard hat was gone. The thing about my hard hat was that it had veiny dongs drawn all over it. I was an apprentice and my co-workers were jerks. Anyways, I walked around the site looking for this hard hat when the safety rep spots me and kicks me off site for the rest of the day. I returned to work the next day with a brand new, dong-free hard hat. I spot someone in the lunchroom wearing a hard hat with large union stickers in about the same spots where I had dongs drawn all over my previous one. Knowing that I'd always written my name in text underneath the plastic insert thing which sits in the hat, I ask this guy if I can look at it, and he says fine. I remove the insert and there's my name just as I left it. The reason that this story is so baffling to me is that my full name is fairly obscure. My family is the only of one of this name in the phone book. I say to this guy, is this hard hat yours? Is your name? He replies, it certainly is. I give him a skeptical, disappointed look and he says don't believe me and begins pulling out his driver's license, bank cards, etc. It turns out he actually has the exact same full name as me, and he did steal my hard hat. I started pulling the stickers off to reveal the big throbbing, glistening erect penises. He says haha, yeah, you got me. I think this would have been even stranger for him, finding a hat with his full name written on it. Anyways, not a supernatural story, just a baffling coincidence. So my out-of-town friend's parents have this oldish farmhouse on property they own. His grandparents used to live and farm there until they retired, but the land stayed in the family. They will not rent out the house to anyone for any reason. This event helped prompt that decision. One afternoon I was out with my friend, we'll call him John, and his buddy on the property shooting each other with paintball guns. It's early afternoon, and we decide to take a break in the house. An empty, somewhat eerie house is irresistible to brave young lads like ourselves. At one point I am standing with John in one of the main rooms, while his friend is still in the doorway. Out of nowhere, John is thrown to the ground towards the door, as if someone shoved him hard in the back. I whirl around, of course, and see nothing. All three of us booked it out of there. I don't know what on earth happened in that house, but I'm not going in again, that's for sure. Originally posted this to our glitch in the matrix. Me and my mom were watching TV in the living room one sunny day. I think it was about 10 years ago or so, give or take a year or two, with the large balcony sliding glass door and shades wide open. There is not a cloud in the sky and the sun is shining brightly, and then everything turns black. Pitch black. Not really. Really cloudy and dark or nighttime dark. I mean black as in complete and utter lack of any type of light whatsoever. This includes the TV itself. No light from anywhere. Both me and my mother scream. And just as quickly as it disappeared, the light has returned. It was only gone for perhaps 2 or 3 seconds. But we both experienced this, so it wasn't like I suddenly went temporarily blind or something like that. But that isn't the only weird part. The sky is a blanket of dark clouds and it is now pouring rain. The rain only lasts for about 2 or 3 minutes and then the sky slowly begins to return to bright sunshine. Nobody else that we know experienced the darkness, but a friend of ours did notice that almost instantly. The beautiful weather turned terrible without notice. We even checked if there was an eclipse or something happening that day, but no, as far as any official news sources were concerned, no eclipses or bizarre weather happened that day. In 1996 my grandma died. A couple of years prior, my uncle had come to town for a visit and brought his cat. During his stay my grandma accidentally let the cat outside. It bolted away and was never seen again. On the night we had the open casket showing, we came back to my grandparents' house. On the front step sitting by the door was the cat. He had an ear tattoo. It was the same cat. A piece of advice I hear often when a cat goes missing is to place something you wear often outside so kitty can use the smell to navigate back home. Perhaps the scent of your uncle was in the air and kitty had been staying with a neighbor all that time. I remember when I was around 9-10 and my uncle coming down the drive and doing his usual greeting to me by throwing me up in the air and catching me again. I ran inside to tell my mum that he had arrived. When I stopped, she was crying and on the phone. After she put down the phone, she turned to me and said, "Your uncle has just had an accident at work and won't ever wake up again still to this day." I have no idea how that thought hallucination happened just moments before I learned of his death. In high school, my friends and I would sneak out of our houses and drive to the beach in the middle of the night. The beach is huge and we would run up and down it and splash in the water. One night, after about an hour of running around, the friend who drove realized he had lost the key at some point. The key wasn't on a keychain, it was just a single key, and we knew we would never be able to find it, and basically we were fricked. We searched up and down for an hour, but we knew ultimately we would have to call one of parents to pick us up. I sat down on the beach while someone made the call and dug my hand deep, like 6 inches, into the sand and felt something. I grabbed it and pulled it out. It was the key. Seriously, divine intervention. That's awesome. So simple, lucky, and dumb enough to probably be true. Well, I'm going to have a hard time sleeping after reading this thread. While in undergrad, I was doing some research that involved soil sampling. I regularly sampled several sites in a wilderness preserve, which would take most of the day to hike through. I always brought a friend, just for safety's sake. There was this one site, way in the rear of the preserve, that always spooked me. No real reason. It was no more isolated than the rest of the sites, but something about it didn't seem quite right. My friend and I were there once, and I was crouching over to sample the soil. I was looking down, and totally unprovoked, I felt this rising terror. Just a frick this, run feeling. I stood up suddenly, and I could see that my friend had the feeling. She said, "We have to leave, now." We ran the entire way to the car. We still have no idea why we felt that way, but I am convinced that there was a very real danger in staying. When I was in 6th grade, my grandfather died. I was in English class, sitting in the front row and doing my class walk. All of a sudden I felt a strong kick in the gut. Whatever happened, it was forceful enough that it made me bend over my desk in pain and brought me to tears. But it went away as fast as it came, and I was just fine a moment later. Out of curiosity, I looked at the clock in the back of the room, and it was about 10:30. I went home at the end of the school day and found out that my grandfather, who I was very close to as my grandparents raised me, had died around 10:30. I really wish I could have an explanation of what happened. When my dad was in the Navy, he was lying in his bunk and felt a kiss on his forehead. Then about 15 minutes later his CO called him in to tell him his grandpa had died. My dad only replies with "I know. He just kissed me goodbye." Back when I was 13, my 9-year-old nephew and my 5-year-old niece were having a pillow fight in my room. Well, we were just having a blast. I was standing at the foot of the bed with my nephew directly in front of me and my niece was to the right side of the bed. Well, my nephew yelled out for us all to stop and look, and I turned around and saw my bedroom doorknob slowly turning side to side. We stood there and watched it for what felt like forever before I finally managed to work up the courage to reach out and open the door. The doorknob continued trying to move beneath my fingers, and only stopped once the door was completely open and there was no one in the small hallway in front of my door. I ran out to ask my sister and granny if they had been doing it, and of course they said no. The 2 kids and I decided to have our pillow fight in the living room after that. Once my sister and her family had left, I came back to my room and, being the scientifically minded child I was, I began testing out every possible way that the doorknob could have acted on its own like that. It was a very hard to turn doorknob that I myself rarely got turned all the way, and I often had to open it for younger kids and my granny, as the mechanisms were rusted inside. It would also not turn on the inside if you turned the knob on the outside. In the end, I concluded something had to have been moving the doorknob physically, and it would have had to have been directly beside me. Unfortunately, this was merely the first in a long line of unexplainable events that happened in and around my bedroom for the next 4 years. I'm not going to get into that here, but if anyone else would like to hear about it, I'll happily write it out for them. I've come to realize this is a horrible thread to read before bed. I come downstairs and see Grandma at the dining room table. She is about to say something. Mongoose is the only thing I can think to myself. No matter what she is about to say, the answer is mongoose. I have no idea why I'm thinking this. I don't know what she's doing. I haven't read or seen anything recently to make me think of the critters, and I can't fathom why this thought has popped into my head. I look over and see her doing a crossword puzzle, and she spits out what she wanted to ask me: what is the animal that kills and eats snakes? That was at least 15 years ago and it still bothers me to this day. When my mother was 22, she was on spring break in Sanibel Island, FL, with a group of her sorority sisters. She and 2 of her roommates walked the beach one evening to drink at a couple of bars down the way. Some of the other sisters met up with them later that evening, but they all split up and went back to the rooms at different times. My mom and her friend left at 3 AM and walked the beach back to the hotel. When they got back to the room, they realized that Michelle made that up. Can't remember her real name. Was the only girl missing. When my mother asked where Michelle was, one of the sisters said that when she was leaving, she saw Michelle outside the bar smoking with an unidentified man. It seemed Michelle had a reputation of wandering away and going home with random guys without telling people, so everyone assumed this was the same scenario. It's spring break. Those things happen, right? Come morning, Michelle was still nowhere to be found. While searching around the beach, one of the sisters got wind that a dead body had been found on the beach earlier that morning. Worried, they called the police and eventually got confirmation that Michelle had been stabbed to death and left on the beach sometime in the early morning hours. The creepy part is that the investigators estimated that she was murdered around 1 AM, meaning that my mother and her friends had surely drunkenly stumbled past her dead, or still barely breathing body in the night, completely unaware. Of course, they could have unknowingly passed her murderer as well. The police never found the person responsible. My mother gets bothered just telling the story. Ugh, that is awful. This will probably get buried as I'm a little late, but one night in college, after a couple of beers and a few joints at a party with friends, I stumbled back to my dorm with my suitamate, my best friend of 4 years. When I awoke the next morning, I noticed that the bed was all wet and sticky. Not urine, not CM, but blood. My pillow, bedsheets and comforter were all covered in blood. The left side of my face too was caked in black, dried blood, all centered around my left ear. Panicking, I went over to my suitamate and he said that I might have had a stroke or something in the night and that we should probably go to the hospital. Okay, I said and proceeded to brush and take a quick shower. There was no pain and my ear wasn't bleeding anymore. So we went to the hospital emergency room and the doctors take one look at me and are shocked. They proceed to tell me all that's wrong with me. My left clavicle has broken through my skin. I have a nasal fracture, a skull fracture, fractures in 2 of my vertebrae and bleeding in my brain. The blood has punctured my left eardrum and made its way out. Additionally, the left side of my face is paralyzed. I am shocked beyond belief. My suitamate too. I have no memory, no recollection at all of what happened the night before. The hospital called the police because they believe someone must have attacked me and I can't remember anything. 2 Yonkers PD cops arrive and question my friend. He swears that he was in my room while I was getting into bed. He says I was drunk and tottering on my feet but I hadn't fallen anywhere and no one had beaten the crap out of me. I believe him and I think the cops did too. But they went back to my school and conducted an investigation which consisted of questioning my friends, checking security cam footage. They found nothing. I couldn't have been beaten up as my friend was with me the whole night and he would have done something. My room was locked from the inside and there was no way to get into the room through the window. I had no external bruising, no minor injuries except for the extremely serious ones I just listed. There was no blood anywhere in my room except for my bed. My bed too has no headboard, no protruding metal pieces, nothing. Until now, I have no idea what happened to me that night. I've mostly recovered from my injuries but the fact that something this inexplicable happened to me is really disturbing. I'm so late to the party, but here goes. I grew up in Roswell, New Mexico. Yup, the Roswell. Anyways, one night right when my clock switched to 1:30 on a Friday in the year 1999, my brother and I were shooting the crap trying to fall asleep. I was 8, he was 5. Everyone else in the house was completely passed out, and suddenly this incredibly blinding light fills the entire room through the window. And I mean, I have never experienced a more powerful light in my life, followed by the most deafening, metallic exploding sound I have ever heard. I mean, it was immediate, just the flash and the boom. I thought I imagined it, but my brother was crying and I could hear my dad scrambling, my mom swearing, and my 2 sisters crying as well. My dad grabbed a gun and bolted outside, setting off our alarm. I followed him out. The sky was completely clear. Not a single cloud in the sky. My dad had finished a run around the house and came back to the doorway and told me to go back inside because it was 3 in the morning. I thought it was weird he said that because, like I said, my clock had just hit 1:30, but I ignored him and ran back to my room. My dad settled everyone down and we and I rolled over to go back to sleep. My clock was shining back at me. It read 3:15. TLDR. After a blinding flash of light and the loudest noise I've ever heard, I am unable to account for an hour and 45 minutes of my life. Oh, and this happened in Roswell, New Mexico. Not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. A couple of years ago on Black Friday I woke up with an eerie feeling, like something was wrong, and just had an overall uneasy feeling that freaked me out. It was about 2 AM at the time, so I walked upstairs and stood in my parents' kitchen. Not even a minute later my mom walks out and asks me if I'm feeling weird. I say yeah, and that it was keeping me up. She says she is feeling the same way, and we just stand there for a minute or two in silence. Suddenly the phone rings, and it's my grandmother. Apparently my grandpa woke up around 2 with chest pains and was being rushed to the hospital. He was about 5% blockage away from the Widowmaker and also suffered a minor stroke. My mom and I are very close to my grandpa and grandma, but it still gives me the chills to think that we could have possibly felt something was wrong while it happened. Hey, I have a weird skill. I don't need alarm clocks. I just check the time when I go to bed, pick the time I need to wake up, and bam, within 5 minutes of that time I will wake up. I am completely incapable of keeping track of time when awake. Oddly enough, I always wake up seconds before my alarm is set to go off, no matter what time I set it. Not sure how to parlay that superpower. This is probably going to get buried, but I have a suspicion that I am on the other end of a story like these. So back in high school my friend and I liked to do what we called urban climbing, which essentially consisted of going out late at night and finding a way to climb onto the roof of one of the various schools scattered around my suburban neighborhood. We never vandalized anything, but it was fun to just hang out up there. One of the times we went a bit earlier than usual. It must have been somewhere between 10 and 11 at night, and we were sitting on the roof of the gym about 2 floors off the ground. The school had a flat roof with a short wall running along the edge so that if you lie flat no one can see you from the ground. So as we are just chilling looking out over the neighborhood, we suddenly hear voices and take cover to make sure no one sees us and gets us in trouble. We quickly realize that this is not something we need to worry about, as it appears to be a pack of high school students a few grades down from us talking loudly and yelling to each other. This is where we get an evil idea. My friend has the ability to do an extremely eerie scream. Think Black Riders from Lord of the Rings. So we hide from view and he screams really loudly. The group goes instantly silent and he screams again. It takes about 5 seconds and then we hear what is probably someone setting a new land speed record in flip-flops. I mean, just booking it. We couldn't see them directly. There were trees in the way, but we could hear the loud slapping noise their shoes were making. The fact that this sound carried over 300 feet through some trees should tell you how fast they were going. We almost gave away our position by laughing too hard. It was a good night. TL. Doctor was the scary scream. Someone probably has a story about how they ran home after hearing it. Late last year I was snoozing in my room early in the morning when I stretched out in my bed, lying on my back. After about 10 seconds I felt something tap the tip of my toe 3 times. I sat up in bed, looked around the room and saw nothing. Freaked out, I pulled myself into the fetal position and somehow managed to fall back asleep. Later that same day, something told me not to stay in my room for the night, so I left the door open and slept in another room. My brother came home and decided to close my bedroom door. As he reached into my room for the handle, he said he heard something snarl at him. He slammed the door shut and came racing into the room I was in, completely freaked out. I didn't sleep very well that night. Don't stop there. What happened after he came in screaming? I once was driving in the University District of Seattle, WA, in the middle of the night, probably 1 AM or so. It was just me and one passenger. We aren't from Seattle and were waiting a light to make a U-turn to find the freeway again. We were the only car at the intersection, but we waited about 3 minutes while the light was red. As soon as our light turned green, a huge marching band, presumably UWs, began to march across the intersection and into the lane we wanted to turn into. At 1 AM, every single member was in costume, and they were not playing their instruments. It was incredibly eerie and my passenger and I were just sitting there open-mouthed. We both remember it exactly the same, but it was one of those memories that you think, did that actually happen? Not that cool, but pretty random. The first 2 years I went to college, I still lived with my parents, so I had to commute about an hour each way. I had a killer final at about 10 AM. You know, the final where you are going to need every second and the instructor even warns everyone not to be late. For some dumb reason I was running late. I figured I would be from 20-30 minutes late, but I am a good test taker, so might still be able to turn it around. Now my parents live in the foothills, and the college is in a large valley. When I hit the valley I also hit a wall of fog so dense that I could barely see the road 10 featuring in front of the car. If you have ever experienced tule fog, you will know what I am talking about. It is not unheard of in our area to get 30 and 40 car pileups as a result of this dense fog. I had to slow my pace to a crawl and peer and strain just to make out the yellow line so I would not cross over and be on the wrong side of the road. My speed went from about 65 to about 20, and that was as fast as I could reasonably go. I was super stressed and mentally cursing myself for not considering the possibility that I might run into problems on the way to school, and running through my mind different ways of begging my professor for extra time. I was so stressed I took a wrong turn and found myself somewhat lost. I did not recognize the street I was on. It's an agriculture area, so there are not really any landmarks to speak of, just roads and fields of trees or crops. I was fairly confident I was going in the right direction at least, so I kept on, and after a bit of trial and error taking this road and that, I eventually found myself on a road I recognized the name of and eventually found my way into town to my university. I was almost literally sweating bullets though. I did not wear a watch, but I knew from when I left, and all the extra time I sucked up creeping through that fog, that I was going to be at least an hour late. I figured the best course of action was to go to the class and throw myself on the mercies of the professor. At least the fog was a reasonable excuse. I got there, and there was no one there. I cursed and fumed, figuring that I had missed the final entirely. Then I checked the clock in the classroom. I was half an hour early. I have run this thing through my head hundreds of times. There is no rational explanation for how this could have happened. I accidentally time traveled. TLDR. I accidentally time traveled and arrived early for a final I should have missed. Don't know WTF happened. A few summers ago I went prospecting camping with my son and his dad in a national forest in southern Oregon. Our claim was miles away from the nearest town up some truly scary forestry roads. We set up camp close to a stream in a big clearing. One night we were playing cards and I heard a almost guttural scream. So and his dad had been drinking and they were being so loud they missed it. After getting them to shut up for a second, I heard the scream again, but from a different location. The second scream sounded more feminine or something like that. Anyways, that night we heard what sounded like someone putting their arms in the stream and lifting them out over and over again. I kid you not, it sounded like something was effing washing something in that stream. We also had rocks thrown at our tent. This was the worst night of my life. I have never been so scared. It's worse because I can't put reason behind any of those occurrences. Probably foxes, man. Vixens screamed like banshees. Still the craziest freaking thing I've ever seen. I was 13 or so, with my dad camping by the Kern River. We had met this dude Jeff who we became fishing buddies with, and he ended up setting up camp with us at our site. Well, one night we're sitting around telling stories, and my dad gets tired and goes to bed. So then it's just me and this dude talking, telling stories, act. Everything is going fine when I look up to see a white fuzzy ball about the size of a volleyball coming towards us. At first your brain does the checklist. Animal, garbage blowing, balloon, act. It didn't cinch. Jeff, what's that? I asked. Jeff looked up at this thing, slowly coming towards us, clearly floating several inches off the ground. I don't know. He trailed off. It came closer and closer to our fire. I remember it was moving the grass, but only the tops of the grass were pushed down as it came along its path. Our conversation, meanwhile, was stuck on repeat. Jeff, what is that? I don't know. Jeff, what is that thing? I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. By now it had come right up to our fire. It was solid, but the edges were diffuse, like fuzzed out. We were like 3 feet from it. It stopped before going right into the flames, went around to the opposite side we were sitting on, and then floated right on up a hill and disappeared over the top onto the road. At this point we were both just sitting there breathing heavily. After a few minutes we got up to look for it, ran up to the road, but it was gone. My dad told me on the car ride home if Jeff hadn't seen the same thing he never would have believed me. I will never, ever know what this thing was, ever, and it bothers me to this day. My grandfather was an amazing lawn bowler. He contended on a national level. It was his life after he retired. He loved the game. About 10 years ago, he passed away from a severe brain tumor. The day after he was buried, his bowling balls disappeared, and to this day we can't find them. Pretty eerie, but awesome. Okay, I have one that I've stopped telling because really, no one believed me. So my best friend and I were hanging out on Halloween night, about 6 years ago. It was late. Trick-or-treaters had gone home and there was nobody awake on the street, but we were still hanging out in her driveway, just looking at the stars, chatting a little, but mostly silent. I had my head cranked towards the heavens when she nudged me. Look, she pointed across the street. I had trouble making out what she was showing me, but I saw it eventually. It was a small, cylindrical light, floating about 10 feet from the asphalt. It wasn't stationary, but sort of moved with the breeze. It was emitting a faint golden glow. Very pretty, almost the size of a glow stick. We watched it for a while. She amazed me, scared witless, before it did a little circle in the air and disappeared upwards. Shortly after that, we saw another floating light, but this time, it was a purplish blue sphere, about the size of a tennis ball. It was moving faster than the previous light, and as we watched, it pitched itself forward so that it zoomed past our heads and into her neighbor's side yard, which was visible from where we were standing. The light it gave off was reflected on the pale stucco wall, so even though we couldn't see the object, it was still there. Eventually it faded, leaving me scared shitless and her more curious than I liked. I dragged her back inside before we were abducted or something. The only unbelievable thing that's ever happened to me. Nothing interesting ever happens to me, but a friend used to work on what I'd call a corporate farm. He was sent out to do field work with a tractor, but it was at night. He was out in the wide open of the field when something hovered over the tractor and illuminated the spot he was on with a powerful orangish light. Hovered for a bit and then it was gone. There was no sound accompanying it. He's not the sort that goes in for boisterous stories and tales of bravado. It just scared him and the story came out of him one day. When my mom was in her 20s, she went on a 6-month boat trip with her boyfriend and other friend. One night they were just sitting at the front of the boat and they saw a light in the sky. It was glowing brighter and brighter and then shrank down to a small dot in the sky. It then zoomed off into the sky. The next day, an army boat was passing by and asked them if they had seen anything strange and they told them. The army men told my mom that it was just them practicing shooting missiles. However, it was the only army boat they ever saw during their whole 6-month trip. She still says she doesn't believe it was army practice. It was probably just a weather balloon. This is going to be buried under all the comments, but this is my unexplainable encounter. I was obviously too young at the time to remember any of this, but my parents told me about it and my older brother and sister both confirm it. When I was just under 2 years old, we started renting a crappy tiny little house out in the boonies. Shortly after we moved and I started having awful nightmares, something I'd never suffered from before. I would wake up screaming fireman, fireman and point out the window. Obviously, since we were in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, there were no firemen outside. Nor did my parents recall me ever being scared by sirens, firemen before. The nightmares and fear were new and inexplicable. We moved a lot back then and did not live in the house for more than 5 or 6 months. But I had the nightmares consistently the whole time we lived there. After we moved, they stopped immediately. Years later we had moved again to another town 30 minutes or so away. My mom stayed friendly with several people from the small town we'd moved from and was visiting with one of them. Somehow the topic turned to the house we rented and my mom mentioned how it hadn't been a great place to live for a lot of reasons, but she also happened to mention my nightmares. The woman she was visiting was horrified and proceeded to tell my mom that the previous owner of the home had been a raging alcoholic who had either accidentally or intentionally set himself on fire after building a campfire in the side yard. He had died from his injuries. The place where he had burned to death was the same place I pointed to every time I had the nightmare. I wasn't terrified of firemen, I was terrified of the fireman. The one I somehow saw outside the house every night, self-immolating. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.